I think one of the most toxic things that has happened in the past few years has been talking about trans rights as a debate. So, you get invited onto a show where someone thinks trans people shouldn't exist, and then you're supposed to debate them, but that's obviously not a conversation at all. It's just a kind of 2-minute argument to get the ratings up. So I was just constantly finding myself having to defend myself on kind of whether it be journalistically on a TV, and I was like, wow, I always feel like I'm on the back foot. They always bring you on to argue against someone, and that's not very kind of empowering position to view your identity in, is when they only really want you as a kind of site of conflict. So I was like, I would love 80,000 words to be able to write about my experience with no one shouting back at me, except the voices in my head, which were there the whole time. And that was kind of what the book for me was, a way to kind of really demonstrate the nuance of kind of being a Muslim or queer identity without having to defend the experience at all, or even justify why it exists. There's none of that in the book, or there's no kind of polemics of, is it okay to be queer or this? It's just my experience, and people can infer from it what they want. And also, I was kind of noticing, especially like on the left of politics or kind of social politics, everyone was becoming quite obsessed with the word intersectionality without, I don't really think, understanding what it meant. I feel like whenever I read about mostly white writers, love white people, by the way, I'm sorry. I have sex with them, so it's fine. I actually explore that in the book, why actually a lot of people of color can kind of fetishize white people, but that's chapter 4, so you're gonna have to get there. Yes, a lot of white people kind of have got quite obsessed with the term intersectionality as this really wonderful thing of, wow, isn't it great? Identity is so complicated, and race and gender are linked, and it's all so fluid, and it's all so, everyone's moving between social groups. And that idea, I think, does hold in theory, but the experience of having someone who has an intersectional identity is, it's really not a fluid experience at all. It's very sort of, you're this or that in that particular space. So, being too gay for Muslims and a bit too Muslim for gays, and kind of the experience of intersectionality for the people who really do exist at intersections is, you're always actually a conflict with one side of yourself in every different space. And I thought that was missing with the discussion of intersectionality, because it was so fetishized. And, I even just saw it a lot in Labour conferences of just like, yeah, we're all just one big group of people, and that's, lovely in theory, but again, I really wanted to explore that theory. So the book essentially stages the intersections at which kind of my life has been founded upon, and sometimes really odd and hilarious or surprising intersections. So it starts off in the Middle East, where I was raised, and before I knew what gay or queer was, I had a very happy time in the Middle East, which I'm going to say was much queerer than Britain in many ways, because Britain is quite socially constipated in a way, and everyone's quite kind of, emotionally stunted, I feel. No offense, guys. Loved the Union Jack, by the way, up there on the 4th floor, or whatever it was. Really Brexit. So like the Middle East for me was this wonderful place of what I think is kind of missing in Britain that I see is like we have such a emphasis on family and bonding, and the way that we treat the elderly in the Middle East, so different to what I've noticed in the UK. Like the older women get in the Middle East, the more revered they are. Like our grandparents would walk in and we would basically like bow, and your whole life is about just treating the elderly kind of with reverence. And there was my mum, who is really the main feature of the book, is before she became a real homophobe, or I knew she was a homophobe, she was a drag queen to me. The campest woman I've ever met in my entire life. For instance, when EasyJet didn't let her on to the flight because she brought 5 suitcases, she screamed at the top of her lungs in the middle of Heathrow, "This is not EasyJet, this is difficult jet." When her dress broke for a wedding that we had to go to, but all the family had already seen all the other outfits she had, so she didn't know what to do. She managed to fix it by inviting a welder to the house to fix the dress, because I had a metal cloth. So she's really, really... So the Middle East, so the first kind of intersection I look at is how kind of the Middle East, for all its kind of homophobic problems, has this kind of real pocket of queerness that I'm really missing in the UK. And then it comes to when I moved to the UK in around 2003, which was also, I'm from Iraq, was the year that obviously Britain became kind of complicit in bombing Iraq. And it was a really interesting time because I was realizing I was queer and my faith and my family were so against it. And then I moved to the UK. I kind of entered quite like a binary, I suppose, I hear a lot of second generation immigrants talk about this, but I was like, okay, cool. Well, I'm not Arab and Muslim anymore, so I'm going to just try being white. And I came out as white to my parents. I mean, I think they were more relieved that it wasn't gay yet. And like went to a speech therapist and literally tried to like be more British because I just felt like, like Arab society is not going to really be able to accommodate me. And so the second part of the book is really talking about that immigrant experience of trying to assimilate into a culture. And I did a very stupid thing, which was, because home was getting so turbulent, I decided to go to a boarding school on a scholarship. And I went to Eton for 2 years to try and be a white man, basically. And that was just a complete mess of me not really understanding British culture. Like I tried to audition for the chapel choir and then sang All I Want for Christmas Is You as my hymn. And like would literally go around being like, hey governors, how we doing? Like really trying to like do all that. And I think the kind of saddest bit about Eton for me was I was getting so bullied for being gay, but everyone around me was white and quite Islamophobic because it was a really Islamophobic time in Britain with like the war on terror and just some of the rhetoric. So something that I still regret to this day is as a way to kind of get everyone off my back, I kind of fed their Islamophobia and was quite like, yeah, no, Muslims are regressive and this is what my parents have done to me. And it was the only way to get them off my back. And I actually still have nightmares that like anyone who I was kind of helping fuel their Islamophobia is somewhere in government drafting legislation somewhere at the moment. It's like this big fear that I have. So it kind of talks about, so that second chapter of the book is more about trying to be white at the expense of my Arab identity and some of the Islamophobia that I encountered at school. Hello, come in. And then the next chapter is about discovering drag. And drag was, at the beginning of my life, when I was like 19, when I started it, was a really confusing and happy experience. I always loved being in drag, and then I felt incredibly depressed whenever I was not in drag. And because I saw the drag as kind of part of my expression of being in the West and being allowed to be queer, I was only really dressing as white women. When I look back at my early drag career, I was literally just only referencing white images of beauty. I think because I felt like my drag was like an escape from my past. And that started to feel really, really frazzling for me, like really schizophrenic, almost like, it was very, very odd. It was like, while everyone around me who was doing drag was almost feeling their selves kind of come together. Every time I did drag, it kind of felt like they were pulling apart because I was almost pretending to be this like really empowered queer Westerner when I still had so much unresolved stuff. And so the end of the book really is about me trying to reconnect with my family and my faith. And it turns out that the Quran is very queer. Cue fatwa. But there's a lot of stuff in there that is actually quite hospitable to queer identity. And the more in which I kind of looked back to Arab heritage and that really early period of my life when I was really loving in the Middle East, I was kind of realizing that the entire reason I was doing drag was so that I could essentially be close to my mum in some way. And she was like my biggest inspiration. So I've started dressing as her and wearing a lot of the Arab pop stars who I used to love as a child. So the end is about trying to use drag as a way to bring all those intersections together in a sometimes messy, but hopefully happy way. So that's kind of the overview of the book. But yeah, I'll take questions from who's interviewing me. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So that was at warp speed. Did you guys hear what I was saying?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. That's good.
And thanks for that overview, Amrou. So I'd like to start by talking about the experience of writing the book. I know memoirs are always personal, but you're talking about your sexuality, gender, your relationships with family. I mean, that's personal. What was it like to write about that?
It was It was good because, like with family, sometimes it's really hard to see what's going on because it's a bit like a hand on your face. You can't really quite make out. So it was actually really useful almost having to like put it out on the page three-dimensionally. And the writing the book was kind of became a sort of act of forgiveness towards what my parents have done. And I won't give away some of the crazy stuff that they did to kind of stop me being, me. But I, in my head, just had them as sort of villains because, you just kind of set up those quite basic roles for people in your head. And having to kind of, because, it's 80,000 words, so you have to really give everything a lot of space. And having that many words and that much time to almost evaluate the three-dimensionality of what was actually happening in my childhood kind of made me start to understand their perspective. Not in a way to kind of say it was okay, but to just like, everyone's got their own story. And at the end of the book, I talked to my mum about it. I actually don't want to give away what she said because I think it is quite surprising. But almost realizing that they were their own characters, and it wasn't actually just like, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. Like they are, Muslim. My mum is especially kind of a very delicate woman who's never been allowed to express anything. And suddenly she had a child who was like fucking expressing the fuck out of everything. And what that brought out in her, like what that, I think when I now really think about my family's response, I actually feel a really intense jealousy from my mother as from someone as a Middle Eastern woman who's just she's kind of just done whatever my dad has said. And then, I've been like, I actually don't agree with any of this and now I'm going to do whatever I want. So I think that was what was quite surprising in writing the book, was actually like understanding their story and their POV. It was also, I also had a nervous breakdown when I finished it, just because I was like, it just does bring up a lot of stuff. But then also, I should have used my book advance to like save for something, but I rented an apartment in New York and had loads of sex and just ate really good food and would really now rather that was in a mortgage deposit, but that's not happened. But I wanted to be very kind to myself when I was writing the book because it was so, and also I talk about it in the book, but I have really intense OCD that's come from religion. So I gave myself 6 weeks to write it, 250 words an hour, and then like, that's kind of how I broke down the days. So it was a bit of a religious experience even writing it, to be honest.
That's beautiful. In the book, your twin brother doesn't really feature until near the end because of the way that you sort of almost aligned yourself to different parents and led very different lives. But near the end, there's a massive improvement in that relationship. What led to that improvement?
So yeah, I have a twin brother. So if any of you girls fancy me and want a straight guy, go for it. It's weird. It's like my brother. It's really weird. We were actually raised quite separately, and it's quite hard to explain to people because I was a problem. I was a problem child. The whole community was aware of like. I always talk about the Middle East as sort of the way that I experience the Iraqi community is that there's no real individuals, but the family is one individual, kind of like there's a collective self, like, and everyone operates by the rules. And if someone starts to like, everyone has to, almost like a cancer, everyone comes in and is like, right, we've got to get rid of this. So, because that was happening, because I was just saying stuff out loud without realizing it was bad. Like, I really fancy Macaulay Culkin, can I marry him? I said when I was 10. Or like, I fancy Robin Hood, the cartoon fox, quite hot. So we were just kept quite separate, to be honest, because there was like a different regime for me and a different regime for him. There was like and so I really don't have many memories of him in my childhood at all. And then I left home when I was 16 and never really came back. But recently we've almost got to know each other, which sounds weird as twins, right? Like, but I'm like, wow, like you've had a really interesting life, Rob. Like we just literally, there's so little parallel. But one thing that we've come to understand is that both of us were really affected by masculinity in very different ways. He was affected by it in that he achieved everything that masculinity should give an Arab man, so much so that he was, I think, kind of ensnared by it. And he was almost mimicking all the kind of masculine role models in his life. And now, nearing 30, I feel him kind of going, wait, did I subscribe to any of this? And what do I actually, because I think he maybe did follow a case of social reproduction and mimicked what older generations were doing. Whereas for me, obviously, masculinity really rejected me, so I went the other way. But they are kind of two parts of the same coin. And we are just exploring that. And I mean, he lives in Dubai, no tax. So I should have really sent my book money there. But yeah, so
Is that bond still strengthening even now?
yeah, it is. I mean, we don't see much of each other in truth because we live in different countries, and I actually can't go to Dubai now for safety reasons. But yeah, it is. And also, like, we have funny kind of moments where I'm like, do you remember this that happened? And he's like, yeah, but I thought this was happening. We're almost like
Different lenses.
yeah, different lenses. Anyway, but he's a really very good person. And he came to like a drag show recently and was like trying to be a homeboy about it, So he was like, yeah, that's my bro, and like had a cigar and so yeah, he's a sweetheart. He is a real sweetheart. I love him very much.
Lovely. I really enjoyed the descriptions of the tropical fish. I feel like I'm a tropical fish myself,
cool.
being from the Caribbean, and also the explanations of quantum physics and how you related all of that back to who you are. Would you mind talking a bit about those analogies and how they reflect your experiences?
Sure. So when I was 13, I became obsessed with marine biology, like in a kind of crazy obsessed. It was actually Duke of Edinburgh. Does everyone remember that? Completely, really did not help with any university admission, by the way. But that's how it was pitched. And there was like a hobby you had to achieve, and you could do aquarium keeping. And near where on my walk home from school in Chiswick, I had to go past, and there was this aquarium shop, and I became like obsessed with marine biology because it just felt. So I had really, medical attention-seeking OCD at that point. Was counting, because in Islam you count sins on your left shoulder and then good deeds on your right, and like my left was just way too high, and I was trying to. Actually, all chiropractors notice that they can't actually adjust my left side as much, so that's kind of mind and body, whatever. But so I was a very OCD and counting everything, but that always kind of seemed to go away whenever I went to see marine biology, because there's something so kind of formless in the ocean, and I'm so interested in how like hermaphroditic a lot of the anemones are, and a lot of fish actually will help each other. Like there's so much symbiosis in a way that human beings aren't actually even that nice to each other, but there's a lot more kind of socialism down there, and the way that it's quite woke, I think, basically in the ocean. And I just grew upset, and then I worked there every weekend for 4 years. I kept a tank at home, and it was like when home got really bad, I kind of always had that as a sort of like alternative universe, and I think that was. I mean, obviously, I didn't have the language to say that, to know that I was non-binary at the time, but I think the reason I had such an affinity was because I think there is something really non-binary in the ocean. And actually, so many queer writers have always gone to the ocean and gone to tentacles, actually, and octopi. And there are lots of fish that are trans. Like when a male dies, the female will just transition, which I think is pretty awesome. And it's really also non-Cartesian down there. Like octopi, like their brains are in their bodies, and I think they're just kind of more sophisticated than we are. We're just like, So I became really obsessed. I had to give away the tank. Well, something happens with the tank. But when the quantum physics was, when I left university, I suffered a really bad nervous breakdown because of stuff that was happening with my family. And then I read about quantum physics, which is this amazing sect of physics, which is basically, I think, queer physics. So if like Newtonian physics is like heteronormativity, quantum physics is like queer theory, in the sense that whereas Newtonian physics is looking for kind of fixed universal formula and principles, quantum physics is looking at subatomic particles which actually defy what we observe in the universe. And actually, like, the same particle can be in multiple places at the same time. Multiple events of a singular event happen, and you have these superimpositions where reality kind of essentially estimates what's happened. So then I was like, wow, like, when I was having real trouble reconciling, like, how the hell can I be queer and also hold on to being Muslim and Arab, and is it ever going to work? When I started to read about quantum physics and speak to other queer people who are obsessed with quantum physics, it was like, oh, even our atoms are queer. So I'm the normal one, and like straight men and women are defying law of physics. Sorry, guys. No, because obviously, whatever, be what you want. But I thought it was a really good way of actually understanding that kind of all gender, sexual, and social constructs must be false if even just the smallest things in our universe are full of contradictions.
Yeah, we're all normal.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, except Trump.
Well, another thing that you talk about quite a bit is your relationship with Islam, and particularly the way that Islam was presented to you as a young person, and then how you were able to reconnect with Islam later on as you discovered other readings of the Quran, discovering the queerness of the Quran. What reactions do you get from various Muslim communities to the book?
Well, to be honest, I'm kind of used to hate. So I mean, very conservative Muslims hate me, the far right hate me. So I'm just like, but yeah, I mean, it's toxic at the moment, especially what happened in Birmingham with the kind of protests outside the school. I obviously, like, my Twitter DMs are a shit show. So like that's a mood, but there are queer Muslim groups in London, and in real life with them, talking to them. I think what's quite interesting is whenever I have a conservative Muslim, message me saying like, what you're doing is an abomination or that kind of thing, I try and be nice, and I say, okay, show me the bit in the Quran that says that. And there's usually no verse that says that. And actually the only reading in the Quran that could be used as a kind of warning against homosexuality is actually really ambiguous, and it is essentially the story of Lot, where a group of male visitors enter a village, and the kind of king of it sort of rapes them against their consent, and that has been used as the warning against homosexuality. But like, it's, when you break it down, it's about rape. It's not even about, and there's and that's the only thing. So obviously, like with anything, the Bible or the Torah or whatever, like, there are conservative readings. But in the 10th century in Islam, until the 10th century, there is this thing called ijtihad, which was basically Muslims were supposed to all come together and debate their interpretation of the Quran, because it's more of a poem. Like, it's quite poetic, the Quran, and it's open to ambiguity. It has a kind of ambiguous feel to it. It's not a set of commandments in that way. And that was actually instructed. You all have to debate it and come away and take your own interpretation. Few reasons why that's not the case anymore. Obviously just conservatism, but also colonialism, which actually brought really binary ideas of sexuality and gender to the Middle East. So that is what I say whenever I get hate. I just did say, show me the place that there's nothing that actually says that. And that usually can shut someone up, actually.
Good.
Yeah. So that's what I try and do. I'm aware that we're living in a bit of a culture war at the moment, so kind of just have to switch off my Twitter sometimes. I do get death threats, though. But I'm like, Mummy, I've made it.
It does seem that queer Arabs don't have the same representation and visibility as many other demographics have in our culture. And I understand there's a lot of difficulties for QTI, POC, queer, trans, intersex people of color to get published and to get our stories out there. How did you navigate those difficulties?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one thing that I found hard in the initial stages of my career, like as a screenwriter, which is like what I do most days, is when I was commissioned, and broadly speaking, the commissioners are white and straight, broadly. I mean, there is incremental change happening. But broadly speaking, I think what was happening was people would be like, okay, great, you're Arab and queer, come on in, we need some diversity. But they usually wanted a kind of tragic story, is what I was getting all the time. Like, ooh, we kind of want, is this going to be a thing where your parents, try and behead you? What's this going to be like, And actually, it's not at all like that. And actually, what I hope Unicorn is I've tried to be as funny as I can in the book and as lighthearted. And whenever I was like pitching that stuff, everyone was like, oh, it's not what we wanted, not what we wanted. So I think part of the reason you don't see the representation is that there is quite a specific idea of what a lot of commissioners want. They want something to be quite worthy, basically. And actually, my cynical reading is that they want something that will affirm their position as white saviors. So I think that's part of the reason, is that queer Arabs aren't able to do it with the nuance and reality that it is, Like the fact that my mum is a character who is, by all accounts of the imagination, really conservative and homophobic, but kind of wonderful despite that. And like, I think maybe people just go, well, I don't know how this is going to work. Like, what is it this or is it that? So I think the nuance scares a lot of commissioners. And then also you just have like a problem that, I've seen this when I've dated white guys, when they're a bit like, wait, I can't meet your parents, but I thought you were out to them. That seems really backwards, and they just don't understand the cultural differences that, like, actually, I don't have the privilege that you have being in a... So I think a lot of queer Arabs actually just don't have the privilege of being able to make that work because they want to retain their family. I had to, make a decision that I would have to just go it on my own, but not everyone, I guess, feels ready to do that, and nor should they have to be honest, but... So I think that's part of the reason as well.
Do you feel like we can reclaim the power to take control of our narratives and the way that we're represented in the media without compromising our stories and our identities?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, there just has to be the space for it first. I mean, I was really overwhelmed when we took this to publishers. How I think there is... and I mean, Fourth Estate have been amazing with just, write what you want to write. But I think there is, the audience is out there. And I think things are changing now, even just like with SVODs and online. I think people are aware that audiences are hungry for original content. So I hope so. I'm a bit over the debate format that the BBC does. I know the BBC have to be non-partisan, but like if they bring on, a non-binary person, they apparently, because of non-partisan laws, have to bring on someone who's against non-binary people. And I don't think QTI, POC people should have to endure debating their identity. It's just not, you wouldn't ask a straight person to do it, although they felt entitled to have straight pride, so maybe they are feeling invalidated. I cannot. So yeah, I think I would like to see less reactive news stories as well. So less like, this Islamophobic thing happened, let's get a Muslim person to defend it, and more slots which are just like, this person wants to talk to you about this, rather than like framed in that conflict way, is what I think.
Yeah, why should we constantly have to debate our existence?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and speaking of, it seems like, as a non-binary person myself, it's a constant struggle for acceptance, even just getting people to accept singular they as grammatically correct, far less socially correct, it's a struggle. What sort of advice would you have for us as Google as to what we can do to make things better for trans and gender non-conforming folks?
Is this like an LGBT society, by the way? Oh.
This has been organized by a combination of talks at Google, trans at Google, and Gaglers, which is a cheeky way of, yeah, you worked it out.
Are people good on pronouns here?
I've got a badge on.
Oh, you've got a badge. I sometimes use that.
People need a reminder.
Yeah. I'm really, really so not aware of what offices are like that I don't know how to give you advice on this. It's like probably the first office I've been to in a while. So I'm not going to give advice that actually might, I don't know. I mean, with the pronoun thing, I always think it's important to ask someone what their pronoun is and not what their gender is, rather than that's something that I, not like, what do you define as, but more just like, what pronouns would you like to use? And that's that. And no further questions, I think is really, really important. Yeah, and I'll visit more offices and try and, I don't know, sorry.
That's totally fine. One last question before we open up to the audience. I really, I didn't get to read it thoroughly, but I read a few key bits, and I just cannot believe that this is your first book. Oh. It's so beautifully written.
Oh, thank you so much.
And I really hope that this is not the last word from you. Oh. So is there anything else in the pipeline, any more books coming out? Or?
I'm not writing, this is my book. I don't know if I'll write another one soon, but I'm currently writing, so BBC America are currently doing an adaptation of Terry Pratchett's books. I'm writing one episode for them, which is it's got all the quantum physics queer stuff in there. So just mostly doing screen stuff at the moment. Then hopefully a TV show, we're waiting to hear from Channel 4 if they're gonna make it or not, but it's about a Middle Eastern drag queen having to live with his mother, who's more of a drag queen than the drag queen, and who actually ends up sort of being the inspiration for the drag career without even realizing. So sort of Bend It Like Beckham means drag.
Oh, I really hope that gets made. I can't wait. Great, well, we've got a bit of time for questions from the audience. I'd just like to remind everyone that since we are filming for YouTube, that we will need you to speak into the microphone. It won't make you any louder, but it will make you audible to the internet. So if anyone's got any questions.
So you mentioned that you wrote the book in part because you felt maybe an internal obligation to tell your full story, to not be on the back foot, to not be defensive. How much of your writing the book comes from a feeling of an obligation to share your story to the wider public, to give a new perspective, to educate? And how do you feel about that, if you do think that's part of your reason for writing it?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, that does form a really big part. I'm so, like, I work a bit with a charity called Iraqweer, which is for people in Iraq who are LGBTQIA+. And I really just do have the privilege of a British passport. And, being able to express myself. And I'm in touch with a lot of LGBT people in Iraq or in the Middle East, more kind of through Instagram, which is kind of amazing. The Instagram just like connecting to all these people, and they just cannot express themselves in that way. So I do feel like I want to use the privilege I have of being able to shine a light on those stories and those people. Definitely. I also just want to make stuff that I didn't get to watch or read when I was a kid. Because I think with racial identity is really important that when people talk about queer representation, like when I think about what I was watching growing up, Queer as Folk or Angels in America, stuff that I really, really love, but they're such white shows, and they still really were really beneficial to me. Or Brokeback Mountain, I remember. But I think it's important for queer people of color to be able to identify with queer characters or queer books without feeling like they have to detach their racial identity. And I think that is a journey that I do see a lot of queer people of color going from, which is they kind of escape their racial identity when they're coming out because they feel like queerness is a Western thing. And then they kind of go through a slow process of renegotiating. And that is a very painful and quite confusing journey. So I think, yeah, definitely in terms of queer people, yeah, I definitely want to just do stuff that I wish I had been able to read, I suppose.
Sorry if you talked about this in your book, by the way. It looks really good. A question I had for you is, obviously you mentioned that you kind of grew up in Iraq, and that was you kind of starting to realize that, you know, you might be queer. It was almost an act of rebellion. And then you kind of spoke about your experience moving to England and then being in Eton in a particularly Islamophobic period of history, which was again like you being a person of color and queer is again an act of rebellion. And like even now, unfortunately, Islamophobia and homophobia exists in society all over the world. So again, like the point I'm making is that throughout your life, you've essentially kind of had to rebel just to exist. Is that what you see now as a path to a final destination, or do you think that is what you are?
That's a really good question. No, it's an amazing question. The thing is I actually sometimes don't know with that. Like, I'm thinking of, this idea came into my head just now of when I go to weddings. I usually, like with my queer friends, I'm like, oh God, I don't want to go to the fucking straightest, like most normative thing. Like, we're queer, we shouldn't be going, this is hell, why should we go? Sit down. As soon as they start walking, I'm just like, oh my God, I'm so happy for you. And which I think speaks well to that contradiction of wanting to rebel and not wanting to assimilate, but also really wanting to be accepted. And how do you like negotiate that? I definitely think you're right that like sometimes like my existence is just rebellious or transgressive, but I like to have the choice to be transgressive sometimes, which is why I think I really like drag performing, because at least I feel like I have some agency in like putting on the drag, getting on stage, doing the performance that I decided, you know, where the punchlines are going to be, to give the audience the effect that I want. Like, I've got control over it, and then I can go home, Netflix and chill, and I don't feel transgressive, kind of thing. You know, and there's some days where I will just dress like a straight man just to like, just because I don't have the energy that day. But then I am also of the feeling of that kind of idea of queerness as a horizon, and that you should never land anywhere, because you should always be pushing and always be looking further and further and further, and you know, I don't think in my lifetime I'll get to where that is yet. And I think that you just need those people constantly pushing, because I think it helps everyone in the long run anyway. That's a really good question.
Right now, there's some debate going on around popular terms that have come from Black drag, and my flatmate is like more on the internet than I am, so she brings these things to me. But I'm just curious on your perspective on that, because I think there's this one perspective where it's, you know, it's like a compliment that this has entered society more broadly and it shows integration. But then on the other hand, it's like this came from somewhere and you should like honor that and, you know, give people the permission to like own their own kind of culture. I'm just curious on your perspective.
Yeah. Instinctually, I have like, I do have problems with it. Just because it always feels like the people who will benefit from that assimilation isn't actually the subculture. It's usually like, you know, a magazine for youth culture who wants to sell to loads of white students or that kind of thing. So in terms of, I always like try and think about like sometimes the economic benefit when that kind of stuff happens and where the economy is circulated. And if it's usually like even just Pride, for instance, when the money is actually going, you know, I personally feel that any brand who wants to walk up Pride has to pay some kind of reparation or like specifically show like where the money's going to as a way to be able to walk up Pride. Then I'm kind of cool with it, I think. And in Amsterdam is actually quite interesting that anyone who does have a float, who's a brand, have to prove that they've put like a legislative thing in their company to make it more hospitable or whatever. And I think that's actually good, because I do think we should have more visibility. But I think for me, it's always who's benefiting from that is what I think about. And so, yeah, so instinctually, like, I do grow wary with it. And even when you think about Drag Race, like I was in New York, as I said, when I was writing the book, but I have a lot of drag friends out there who, you know, are not wanting to go on Drag Race. And Drag Race has really ripped up the community there, because, you know, certain queens who go on the show have a much higher fee now, and it's really deregulated the community. And some queens now are like, you know, hustling for $1, and you know, and some queens are getting 5,000 for a night. And it's not that they shouldn't be getting that, because yeah, like, take the money, but I think you know, those subcultures are so precious. And it's actually left a real wound in the New York drag community, Drag Race, which RuPaul, you know, just doesn't really want to address as well. So I think there are questions. Yeah, there are questions for me. A lot of right side questions. Anyone on the left?
So you mentioned briefly about sort of how you saw yourself modeling after white women at some point when you started doing drag, and how it sort of becomes a thing where you have to do some patchwork into sort of all your identities, and maybe that's how I interpreted it. And I was just kind of wondering, when you are creating your own self and like getting all of these and making yourself, what do you use as inspiration? Like, what are your references and things like that?
Yeah, well, recently, for the past like 2 years, just like old images of my mother, basically. I mean, literally, like this woman, she like, I mean, I just cannot actually explain to you. Like, she's gonna be a gay icon one day, and I'm quite, like, she literally is. Like, I honestly have this idea that she's going to come to a gay club to take me home, but she's going to look so good that all the gays are going to be like, yes, it's it. Like, I honestly have this, like, I just know that this is going to happen to her. So, so really my mother, Kulthum, like, you know, just Nancy Ajram and all those like Arabic pop stars, just pictures of relatives, and genuinely, like, my mum is kind of like a runway model in all the stuff that she's worn. So at the moment, I'm having just a lot of time just looking at her, and it's made me also think much more fondly of her. And because I'm like, damn, like whatever you said is good, but you gave me all these looks. So actually, my mum really. Yeah, that's my life. If you're trying to forgive a parent in your head, just dress up as them, guys.
You mentioned mental breakdowns a couple of times, and yet you seem to be such a beautiful and calm and grounded soul. How did you get through all of these? Do you have well, maybe not a process, but anything that worked for you almost every single time that got you to where you are right now?
Yeah, I think actually creating stuff was really good for me. I had this argument with my mum recently because she was like, you know, what you create, it does, you know, because some of her friends read it and they get upset at her, and she's like, you know, you put it out there and it's really selfish of you to put it out there because it affects us. But I kind of made a counter argument, is that I really do think creating was the thing that stopped, you know, maybe something a lot more serious. So yeah, so I mean, creating like drag was kind of therapy in a way. Also, like 200 milligrams of sertraline every day, and CBT and psychodynamic therapy. Like, I'm very open about all that, and there are just some really. I really tried to give a lot of space to that in the book, but about religion with young people, Islam was so. The way that I was taught it, this is not everywhere. You know, Sufism's not really like this, but the way that I was taught it was that, like, you constantly are counting sins. And I think when your brain is plastic and is, you know, neurons are trying to find a way to behave. That just causes a lot of. But for me, the time that I'm least anxious. I'm still very anxious at home. Like I will go home after this and go over everything I've said and like pseudo whip myself, which will be fun. But the time I'm least anxious is being in drag on stage, because you don't even have time to. You have to be so present in what you're doing. You're like, you're connected to the audience there and then. I find that so thrilling, connecting with other people. And it's why I'm also getting a puppy in December, because then I can have a living thing to, get me out of my own brain. I'm getting a cavapouchon, mixed between a bichon frise, Charles Spaniel, and a poodle. So excited. I don't even care about anything else, actually. Yeah. Thanks for such great questions, by the way.
Sounds like we're wrapping. In that case, thank you so much for coming, and thanks everyone as well for all of your questions and for being here.
Yeah,
Let's have one more round of applause for Amrou Al Kadhi.